Today we're here to talk about the music of the great Peter Ilyich Tchaikovsky, my compatriot, Russian, and the greatest composer of all, one of them at least. You know, somebody who influenced a lot of people, including Michael Jackson, as we will see later, and somebody who has defined a lot of theatrical styles of music that were to come later, including film music and even some of the music theater of the 20th century. Tchaikovsky was born in 1840 in a small town of Russia. His family was a wealthy family, and they had music in the house all the time, so he was exposed to music from the early years, and it was during the early years that he developed a talent for music. The family had the piano, so he would literally rush to the piano in the middle of the night and scream that he hears music in his head. And so, of course, later on it was discovered that he actually did hear the music, because all of that music came out and we actually enjoy it today. Tchaikovsky, throughout his life of 53 years, is how long he lived, wrote a tremendous amount of music. He started writing when he was young, and he rose to popularity when he was in his 30s, and then later on he rose to actually big popularity all around the world. He was the one who conducted the opening concert at the Carnegie Hall in New York City for the opening of the Carnegie Hall. He did a lot of other things in Europe. He was a honorary doctor, and also he kind of helped launch careers around the world. For instance, Edward Grieg got a lot of commendation just from Tchaikovsky, speaking highly of him in the circles. So with his early music, though, he was very unhappy with a lot of his compositions because he felt that they weren't expressive enough or they weren't designed well enough, you know, and he thought that some of them were repetitive. We have a lot of letters about all of that. However, what's happening is that some of the music that he discarded later became known as masterpieces. For instance, the Swan Lake that we're going to talk about today was originally conceived as a commission from the Bolshoi Theater in Moscow, and the directors basically had the story already that they designed from several sources, and it was their original story. They hired Tchaikovsky to write the music, so it was more like a gig, I guess, okay? He got paid 800 rubles, which by that time was not that much, really, kind of maybe a third of somebody's yearly income for something that takes 2 years to write. So he took the commission, and when he finished the music, the dancer, principal dancer that he worked with, asked him to include some other composer's music in the ballet. He refused, and she quit the production. So somebody else danced the first premiere and basically was not a big success, not just because somebody else danced it, because the orchestra didn't play well, because of this and that and the other, and they only had 2 rehearsals, apparently, according to the accounts. So it was not an immediate success. Only after Tchaikovsky's death, they actually revived the ballet with Petitpas's choreography. Maurice Petipa was involved in a lot of productions, including the Nutcracker, of course, Tchaikovsky's last ballet. So when they revived it, there was a fair amount of not just revision, but expansion, so that they added a few numbers to the ballet to tailor it to specific dancers that were there, and that production was a great success, and that's what we enjoy till today. I'd like to play you some of Tchaikovsky's music, just as a retrospective. This is something that's very close to my heart. I grew up with this music as a kid, studying piano and composition professionally since age 8, so pretty much It's a part of my soul, and I'd like to convey some of that to you. Well, here's something that I played when I was 8. It's called the Snowdrop, as in the flower. So you see how this theme really works well, and in the middle there you have a challenge for the pianist to pass this melody between the two hands like this, while the other part of the hand is playing the accompaniment. So it's very interesting writing. There's another piece. This is, by the way, from the Seasons. It's the month of April. He wrote 12 of the pieces for each month. Here's one other famous one. It's actually played on a lot of instruments now. It was written originally for the piano, but it's played, of course, on the violin, and people have heard it played on tuba as well. So here is a barcarolle. Etc. So you can see, of course, we all know Tchaikovsky's Nutcracker, for instance. It sounds through the loudspeakers of various shopping establishments every holiday season, so we can't help but know that piece. But there's a lot of other music by Tchaikovsky that is actually sometimes even more expressive than that music, because sometimes he would actually write on his own accord, as opposed to a commission. Now, some of his music that we don't know is actually symphonic music. And we say we don't know it because general public generally does not listen to Tchaikovsky's symphonies on their own accord. They might hear it in a concert, but nobody would really request it on the radio or put it in a CD. Now, those who appreciate classical music know that these are some of the best symphonies ever written, and when Tchaikovsky writes for the orchestra, first of all, he uses the colors of the orchestra very, I should say, sparingly. In other words, there's always a way to have everybody play at once. For instance, the strings and the winds and the brass all playing, and this is how it's done in a marching band. In a symphony orchestra, though, you want to have these contrasts. You want to have these groups contrasting one another, and that's what Tchaikovsky employs in his writing. As opposed to mixing everybody little by little or a lot, he would actually keep the instruments separately. The string section is its own thing, and then the woodwind section is its own thing, and the brass only comes in when necessary. And so as a result, you actually hear these interesting juxtapositions. This is one of his trademark devices, something like this. This is something that you associate with Tchaikovsky, and that's really true. Strings, woodwinds, strings, woodwinds. I'd like to play you some of his symphonic music, though. Here is one of the earlier works, actually earlier than the Swan Lake. Yeah, Swan Lake is kind of an early-ish work of Tchaikovsky. He was in his 30s. He did not yet have his second disastrous marriage yet at that point. So he was actually on his way to success. But the first symphony was written before that, and this theme was in the second movement, and that definitely attracted the attention of a lot of musicians. Why? There is certain Russian quality to it that is hard to match. It's also very European as well as Russian, and that was to become one of his stylistic trends that he would even write in his letters about, saying that he really wants to be the Russian composer who kind of, almost tames the Western influences that are overwhelming on the Russian music, trying to squish it perhaps at that time where he lived. And what he wanted to do is he wanted to promote the Russian music, but he also wanted it to gel with the Western tradition. And that's what we actually hear in some of this music. You can hear that this is a very Russian melody. It skips all the tones in the scale. It just goes for the fifth of the scale and basically returns promptly to the one. So there's no pentatonic, there's no flute sound. This is very much a Russian singing from the villages. And then we have his other symphonies where he develops a lot. Of course, here's a famous one, actually made into a song here in America, a popular song in, I think, 1950s maybe is when it was. But I've actually heard that song on a jukebox one day. I know it exists, even though I heard about it, now I actually heard it as well. So here's the original by Tchaikovsky from his Symphony No. 5. Now, this is interesting. What would you do as a composer right here? There's so much you can do right there. You can go, right? Or you can go, or you can just stop. So here's what he does. He introduces a second theme by the oboe. and then it goes back to the original theme. But then here's this other theme. So this is actually symphonic development by Tchaikovsky. So the second theme comes out of the first theme, if you think about it. So here, the first theme is this. And the second theme comes out of this. It goes like this. Very theatrical, change of scenery, and then like this. Etc. Interesting, right? So the way he develops his music, of course, we know that Wagner was very popular in Germany and the entire world, and one of his trademarks was so-called endless melody. We now call it that, but at the time it was just called Wagner, you know. So Wagner's melody would develop and develop and develop and develop. So Tchaikovsky apparently has inherited that. I think it might have been, I personally think it might have been under influence of Wagner. He actually traveled to see his operas when, well, that was after Swan Lake. So, but it was before this music was written. I think it has to do with this. You see how that works, right? So the melody goes up and then down, but it never really stops. It doesn't just reach a climax and then collapse. It actually keeps going and going and going. That's definitely one of Tchaikovsky's trademarks. Then, of course, we have the Swan Lake. So we're actually talking about the Swan Lake today. There are a few themes in it that are world famous. And of course, the one that comes to mind usually, you know, people who don't like classical music will quote this one. Why? Because they think it sounds cheesy. Well, it's supposed to sound cheesy. Hello? It's exactly what it's designed to do. It's the dance of the little swans. So basically, yeah, it's kind of clumsy. You know, they're not yet big swans. They can't fly probably even at that point. So definitely it's a cheesy piece. And when it comes to the Swan Lake, people usually associate it with this one particular theme. It's called the theme of the swans. etc. This is called the Swan theme. So in the ballet, actually, it starts with a prince party for the young prince at his mother's house. So princess, or I guess she would be a queen, but she's called the princess, and she has a young son who is about to get married to a woman of his desire, whoever she is, and there's a party at his house, at the end of which they go to shoot some swans. And that's basically what it is. And then she meets Odetta the swan, and that swan actually turns into a very nice young lady and tells him the story of the spell by the evil wizard that turned her into a swan. Of course, that's how all fairy tales begin. And only true love, of course, will save her from the ordeal. So that's the premise of the ballet, and then it develops, and of course they do unite in love, but they both have to actually go to the underwater kingdom to be united in their love. So there's definitely late 19th century doom and gloom in that too, because they could not live a happy life in this world somehow, even though the spell was finally broken. So this theme actually appears at the end of Act 1, very briefly, and this right here was the opening of Act 2. The Act 2 is set on the lake. So you go between a big mansion or the ballroom to the lake, and back to the ballroom and to the lake. And that's how the ballet works. What I'd like to do is I'd like to play some more Tchaikovsky's music. Oh, here's a good one I really like. It's called the Autumn Song from the Seasons Again. And this one, you know, Tchaikovsky had a real knack, as we might say, for writing a good melody. It's not just something it is in your soul, but you also have to have the skill to put it together, because a lot of the time you will hear something and you will hear another piece of it. Let's say part A and part C, you know, and you know there has to be a B in the middle, and that's what a lot of composers' work is to kind of patch things together in such a way that everything is seamless, kind of like a woodworker almost. So here's the Autumn Song. Autumn Song. This is just to wake you up. So, of course, we all know the Nutcracker Suite. What I did not know is that Michael Jackson actually gave it a credit for inspiring him for his Thriller album, which was interesting to find out. I learned it accidentally thanks to the World Wide Web and hyperlinks, right? We forgot we sit on one website sometimes and just sit on it and sit on it, whereas what's really powerful about the World Wide Web is that you can actually find somebody who linked to something somewhere else, and then you find this piece of obscure information. And that's what's really that's what really sets it apart from any other media, really, because in the library you can also look for things like this, but you cannot really get a book right there knowing that it will have a reference to this other book on the other shelf, whereas on the web it happens. So something led me to a Russian website which had a Russian translation of the interview, and then I went back to discover the English original. What he's saying in that bit, he's saying a few things. This is 2007. He gave an interview to the Ebony magazine, and so he's talking about various things that influenced him and his early work with Quincy Jones. And then he says this. He says, well, you know, I've always studied composition since I was a kid. I was interested in composition since I was a kid, and basically Tchaikovsky influenced me the most, he says. And he looks at the Nutcracker Suite, basically says, how come that there is an album, he calls it an album actually in that interview, Nutcracker Suite, which is a suite from the ballet, so you realize it's a part of a ballet. So it's basically a selection of dances, right, the Nutcracker Suite. He says, how come there is that album that every song is a killer? That's the word he uses. So, you know, why can't I make an album where every single song is a killer? So he makes an album of songs that are killer, calls it Thriller. And so at that point, you know, he kind of proved something to the humanity, saying that it is possible to design an album with a bunch of hits in it. But the Nutcracker Suite, actually there's a piece in it, the Waltz of the Flowers. I've always been a fan of that piece. I thought, wouldn't it be neat if we could play it on the piano? And so basically I designed this arrangement from the full score that is playable on the piano, but it's barely playable. So I'm going to attempt to play a little bit of it for you right now, just to see if it's possible again. So I played it in concert maybe 2 or 3 times. It's always, you know, a hoot. It's always a little bit of an uh-oh factor. Well, I think this would be a good high point to finish our presentation. Thank you very much, and thank you for your interest in Tchaikovsky's music. I'm Sergei Kossenko, signing out.